Welcome to another episode of Life on Mars. I'm Alex, CEO and founder of MarsBased. And in today's episode, we have Kat O'Brien, Chief Partnerships Officer at ClimateTrade. Kat and I met a few years back through a old client of MarsBased called Polaroo, a B2C company from Barcelona, previously known as We Do It, that we had met at Web Summit in the year 2017, 2018, something like that. And she had been the CMO of that company. After a few years of going back to the US, working in corporates, she returned to Spain, this time in Valencia, to work for ClimateTrade, a company that is right now pre-Series A, offering carbon offset APIs and services for other companies to be compliant with these kind of measures. And what we're discussing here is something that we have never touched on this podcast, which is the value of partnerships, how to get them right, how to find the right person in the organization, how to navigate big corporations if you're a startup, or the other way around, if you're a corporate, how to approach startups and how to avoid killing them in the process of long sales cycles, bureaucracy, procurements. We talk about fast tracking processes. We also share our experiences as MarsBased trying to sell to corporates and how we identify the fast tracking processes, how to shorten the long sales cycles, how to make it easier for us in the long procurement processes and whatnot. Of course, we also discuss other tangential issues like she being established right now in Valencia and the Valencian startup ecosystem. But definitely, this is a very interesting podcast to bring it back because we have been in a too long break for this English version of the podcast. We have had a few speakers canceling last minute, and also we had other internal organization challenges at MarsBased, and while the Spanish-speaking podcast has been running smoothly without any major interruption, the English-speaking has suffered a little bit. But with Kat, we just bring it back. We bring it back in great fashion. This is really interesting episode loaded with a lot of wisdom nuggets. So if you're looking to partner with other companies, same level, or doing free partnerships, paid partnerships, this podcast is very interesting. And lo and behold, we went from 0 recordings per week in the last 2 months to this week we are recording 5 episodes for the podcast. So looks like we're going to release uninterruptedly more episodes for the English-speaking podcast, and hope all's going well with you. Let us know if we can help. Any suggestions for speakers, and this really helps us. Also, subscribe to the channel, share it on social media if you find it interesting, and send some suggestions for speakers. Kat herself has been doing this for a couple of years now. She's sent very interesting people for the podcast, and also just to generally speak with actors of the startup ecosystem. So if you're really interested in hearing somebody's story, let us know. We're looking to expand our network of friends of MarsBased. So without further ado, let's jump right into this episode. And so I was in Valencia last week, and there's a lot of things going on in Valencia. I've been going for several years, and I have to say that for me, it was a lot of marketing back in the day because Lanzadera and the Marina and all of that, it's empty buildings, big names, but no substance to it. And 2023, I think that now everything has coalesced into something that, I see it up and coming. What's your impression of the startup ecosystem nowadays in Valencia?
Well, I joined the startup ecosystem in Valencia last year. I moved here from New York. So I think I've been learning on the ground. I will say, like you, now I was in the US, but pretty familiar with the Spanish startup ecosystem. I was much more familiar with Madrid and Barcelona. In fact, I tried to move to Spain in 2018 and spent my time between Madrid and Barcelona primarily. And I think I've been definitely pleasantly surprised with the amount of startups and the amount of entrepreneurial efforts happening in Valencia. Something I see is that there's a really strong alliance and cooperation between corporate startups as well as government and other organizations like Startup Valencia, for instance, B Startup. And so I think that's bringing a lot of interesting people and helping entrepreneurs to grow, helping startups get off the ground, helping get recognition. I mean, they had a trip to Miami a few months back, and they're doing another one in a couple of months. You had the big Digital Valencia Valencia Digital Summit in October. And so more and more of that. And I think we'll continue to see growth. I hope so. I mean, I'm new here and happy to be here.
Maybe they just wanted to move forward or move on from having only Formula One and other events that were not strictly, business related, even though Formula One might bring a lot of millions into the city, mostly into somebody's pockets, right? But not exactly into the city. And it's kind of like something that moves from city to city. So I don't know to what extent does it create real jobs or real value more than it does, say, a World Cup. But startups and innovation and tech in general, they do. And as a matter of fact, all of these initiatives you mentioned, there's the next web is being hosted in Valencia, I believe next month, if I remember correctly. So while it's not a web summit, it's the equivalent of web summit for a city the size of Valencia. So I think it's going to generate a lot of impact, and definitely having international conferences places Valencia in the map. But as a matter of fact, you and I met in Barcelona because you were the CMO of a company that we used to work for. That back in the day was called We Do It. Now it's called Polaroo. I think they're still around. I haven't followed them actively, and you were the CMO. So was that the first contact with the Spanish startup ecosystem? And if so, what we always know the perspective of local people when they go to the US is like everything is so fast paced, business oriented. People are so driven, people are direct and upfront and whatnot. But we very seldom get to listen the other perspective, right? An American coming to Spain is like, how's it going? Beside these usual stereotypes, but stereotypes are fine in this podcast. So
yeah, so I first came to Spain at 19. I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest, which probably most people don't know, since most people in the US don't seem to know it either. So
I know it because
not
of Slick Nut. They're from there, from Des Moines, right?
Yeah. That's a good one. That's a good one. So I studied abroad in Toledo at 19 for a semester, and I just fell in love with Spain. Me enamoré de España. I came back the next summer and studied in Madrid, and was just really in love with Spain. Got to travel to a lot of different places. But I started my career as a sports reporter, actually, and was not very feasible to come work here as a journalist. But then I went back and got my MBA at Wharton, and I actually interned at Real Madrid, and thought, oh, maybe I could work in Spain, because now I was going to work on the business side in sports. And so the right opportunity things never worked out quite. I almost came and worked for FC Barcelona a few years later. And that's a whole nother story, how that didn't work out. But we'll blame it on Neymar. Legitimately.
All right. I want to hear that.
Well, I was at ESPN, working at ESPN Deportes, so working on the Spanish language side, working on digital social media partnerships. And I had worked with La Liga, with some clubs in La Liga, including Valencia, Barcelona, Real Madrid. And someone who I had worked with externally while I was at ESPN and he was at Barca was leaving. And so I ended up talking with them about a role and interviewed, and basically was told, okay, this is the week I'm going to La Junta, but it was supposed to be an internal hire. Would be the offer. Are you going to accept it? I'm like, absolutely. This is amazing. I'm going to go work for Barca. I like, if you want to work in sports in Spain, working for Real Madrid or Barca or La Liga are definitely the three top type of places you could go. And the very next day, Sandro Jose resigned over the Neymar scandal and the giant fine that they had to pay. And so they decided to not hire any new people. And then hence I never joined FC Barcelona. But I still had that. So when I say I blame it on Neymar, I blame it on Neymar.
I mean, blame it on Sandro Jose. That's like the scandal was because of him. But
yeah, it's a little bit of a joke, but
it's a complicated story.
But anyway,
yeah.
So I almost moved to Barcelona then, and then it didn't work out. And then in 2018, I decided, you know what, it's just time. I'm going to go for it. Voy a por ello. And I decided to come to Spain. I had actually left the sports industry. I was working on partnerships still, but at Samsung Pay, which was a startup Loop Pay that Samsung had acquired. And so I just decided I'm going to go spend a couple of months in Spain, mostly going between Madrid and Barcelona, getting to know people in the startup ecosystem. I also looked at corporates, but I found startups to be kind of more interested in my background, more liable. I found at that time a lot of HR people would be like, oh, but you studied this and now you do this. Well, they just didn't seem to know what to do with me because I'd worked in several areas, and startups, I didn't find that so much. And
Yep.
so ended up getting to know the guys from Polaroo, the two brothers who are two of the three co-founders, David and Mark Rovira. I met them incidentally at the US ambassador's home in Madrid.
Oh, wow.
I went to Incubed Spain, which is an event to help scale up startups and what kind of collaborative effort between the US and Spain. And they had an event at the ambassador's house. I met a bunch of people there. And two of the people I met were those brothers. And so I ended up joining Polaroo as CMO, but my visa was not approved to move to Spain. So that was a very short-lived attempt. Would have been in Barcelona, and I ended up going back to New York and joining MasterCard then. And so I was there then for 3 years until the opportunity came to come to ClimateTrade. And I think I didn't answer your question very well, but
I was going to go back to it,
I
but I know that I have derailed the conversation entirely, so it's partly my fault.
No worries.
So yeah, what was the perspective? What kind of cultural shock does an American experience in Spain? And maybe nowadays it's not so much, because at least Barcelona is much more multicultural. Valencia, to my surprise, has become also very open to digital nomads, expats, and whatnot. Whereas 5 years ago, it was just purely just locals. But what kind of shocks to the culture, like what kind of the differences do you see in business and
So I've spent a lot of time in Spain over the years between study abroad, intern, try to work here, vacations, work trips. So I think I have a better idea coming in than the average, or the vast majority of Americans would. Nevertheless,
definitely you can place it on a map.
I can place it on a map.
Just for
I
a start,
don't think
yeah.
that burritos and enchiladas are the main foods. So,
exactly.
which someone actually said to me when I came to study in Spain at 19 from Iowa. So
Okay.
I was like, I do like those, but they're not really Spanish.
Wait, I once, what do you want to hear something? Well, and I know I'm derailing the conversation again.
That's okay.
Like I was in San Francisco at a party, and somebody told me like, "Oh, you're from Barcelona?" Yeah, I was in Paris last year. I was like, "Okay, cool." And so what? And they're like, "Yeah, because Paris is the capital of Barcelona, right?" And I'm like,
What? Oh my gosh.
You think that San Francisco, you'd like, it's tech
Yeah.
city. You would think
Paris,
like it's more
Barcelona,
educated. It's like whatever.
That's
Anyways,
crazy.
just going back. Let's do it.
Geography is not typically our strength, Americans. So with some good exceptions, of course. But
ask any average European to place Iowa in a map of the United States. We're not. I couldn't do it. So no worries on that.
True, but
you guys are a continent. You are a continent. You are not a country. Yeah. Anyways.
Well, so Barcelona is a country now, and Paris is a capital. Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, some of the things that I may have been surprised at over the years are not surprising to me now, because I've had experience here. And then some things, I think New York is also a very different place than other areas in the US. Like New York has public transit. People walk around. There's a dense center. In many ways, there's a lot more similarities to Europe than with other cities. I think New York's the best city in the United States, so I'm not at all biased whatsoever. But
there you go.
but I think that if I were moving, say, from Texas or from Iowa directly to Spain, that would be a bigger difference. Some things, I mean, work-wise, sometimes I find that people think that we in the US look down on or don't or underestimate companies coming from Spain or from Europe. I've had people tell me that, and I don't feel like we look at it that way at all. I do think, I mean, of course, there's all kinds of people, so different people have different perspectives, but I think in terms of raising money or trying to build a business there, obviously there are hurdles if your workforce, your staff isn't as strong in English. That's going to be a challenge, or just understanding the culture, the business
Right on.
culture. If you're trying to sell into the US, they're different markets. But in terms of, hey, this company is coming from Spain or France or Germany or Portugal, I like, as an American, I'm like, oh, that's cool. They bring a different perspective. There can be pluses, there can be minuses. But I do think that sometimes people kind of don't fully realize the benefits or the advantages that come from here, or maybe downplay, don't think as highly. And as a foreigner, I'm like, oh, there's a lot to offer here. I think what differences, there are different cultures in terms of maybe a little bit more apt to take on risk in the United States. In the startup space, of course, people working in startups, people who are launching startups in Spain are typically more open to taking on risk. But I do think that's culturally more accepted / even expected in the US. And part of that may be just we don't have the same social protection. So if you have a pretty stable job in Spain, that means a lot. I don't like a stable job in the US. Of course, government jobs are relatively stable. There are companies that are relatively stable, but your health insurance is tied to your job. Like me, as someone who came out of business school with more than $200,000 in student loans, and who had to take out many tens of thousands of dollars for medical costs, I couldn't have fathomed going into a startup, because I had this huge amount of money to pay every month for both medical costs and student loans. And those are generally not going to be the case here. Someone could borrow money for school, especially if they go abroad. But I think the social protections are good, but it can make someone a little bit less prone to go out on their own if they're stable. On the other hand, I think it should make it where, hey, I'm still going to have health insurance. If I leave my job and go do something on my own in Spain, I think that in some ways should make it easier to be entrepreneurial, but I do think there's a little bit less culture of that risk.
I think like we are, so to speak, we manage risk differently, right? But before I go into that, I want to circle back to something that you said that I hadn't realized, and it's true. Like there's some sort of condescendence in what typically Americans are like. Oh, this company's coming from Europe. They're like either like trying to sell me something, or they're not that ambitious because they have smaller markets, and if they want to come to the US, it's because they want our money. It's because maybe traditionally European companies never sold to the US prior to the 90s, right? And the first big company that was not American was Skype, right? And so before that, the US had never a tradition of buying stuff from abroad. And then after Skype, we've had some things like cherry pick things like Spotify, maybe some European cars and something like that, but never has been that widely spread as nowadays, right? And nowadays is like, oh yeah, they use like, I don't know, Algolia for search, and then Typeform from Barcelona, and then this and that. But before that, it was like one company from Europe. Therefore, it was like, we can cover ourselves with our own stuff, right? But yeah, never saw it from your perspective. And to me, like I had right now the epiphany of making the analogy with sports is like, it's like when people from other regions in the world come to Europe and they're like, yeah, I want to play football, and they're like, yeah, but what are the chances that you can play football, European, the right kind of football,
Right.
not your football, right? So the one you play with the feet and so on. But like, and chances of like an Australian player being good at football is like not really good. So maybe it's because of that. Like I'm just making this analogy, not saying like nobody is capable of that, but like the probabilities are like greatly diminished. And on the other hand, the level of the risk management is, as you said, like in the US, like you cannot quit your job because then you lose everything that you are always trying to pay back, like to climb back all of these loans and debt that for your entire life, or like for how many years, right? Maybe here we
Yeah.
do it with the mortgage and that's it, but like we are
Yeah.
not at risk in our health insurance.
What
So kind of like probably we take smaller risks, but like a lot more of them. Whereas in the US, maybe you take like
right.
quick risks and really big because it's like go big or go home because I've got like two
Go big or
months
go home. Yeah.
and then I'm just going
Well,
to do
one
something
one
else.
thing that I think, and I believe this is changing to some extent, but one thing that surprised me that I only learned maybe in the last year or two is so an autonomo, like someone who's an independent here, automatically has a quota that they pay every month. Whereas in the
Yeah,
US, you could launch a business and you pay taxes on what you earn on you,
correct. Yeah.
and so if
Pretty
you
much everywhere else in the world, just not Spain, because Spain's
So
different.
that surprised me, but that definitely is a deterrent to starting a business. I know there's a
Correct.
lot happening to try to make it easier. Startup law, which I think does more actually for digital nomads than for startups or for people moving from abroad. Nevertheless, I
100%.
know there's a lot of people working to try to make it easier. I think, if I'm not mistaken, now if you are working full time and you start something on the side as autonomo, you don't have to pay that quota at the same time as you're already paying. But to me, that was surprising because I, over the years, have done lots of freelance work, for instance, and think in Spain, I would have had to automatically pay whatever the autonomous quota was, even if I was making, $500 a month.
That's very complicated. Let's move on to the one of the main topics I wanted to cover today, which is partnerships. Just like we've never covered partnerships in this podcast, so this is literally the first time we're going to cover this, and I'm very excited because I've never had a successful partnership, or very, very rarely, right? And so I want to learn more from somebody who's been in the field for many years, and like both corporate and startups now, right? And so, what is your definition of a good partnership, just generally speaking, or there is none?
So it can mean partnerships can definitely mean different things to different people, different companies, and it has it. I've worked on partnerships at ESPN, at Samsung Pay, at MasterCard, and now for ClimateTrade. And there's different definitions, different types of companies there, both startup, corporate, the sector. To me, it's something where you're collaborating with another company or organization. It could be with an NGO, a government group, and you're helping. You're working mutually on one another's interests, so it helps both people. It's something where if ClimateTrade does a partnership with a corporate to promote something on sustainability or to enable sustainability for the customers of that corporate, we're helping the customers of both companies. We're helping achieve both of our goals. If, at ESPN, if we did a deal with FC Barcelona around partnership, around to give content from FC Barcelona to ESPN consumers, that's something where it's a win-win, or we believe it was a win-win for everyone involved. So because ESPN consumers in the US are able to get more exclusive content of FC Barcelona directly on the platform that they're already using. If it's FC Barcelona is able to get that unique content to consumers in the US that speak Spanish or that speak English, depending which side of ESPN or all the above. So it's something where you're benefiting both sides. You're maybe enhancing the market, growing reach. If we at ClimateTrade work with a large company, we might be helping reach new customers. We might be entering a new market. We're offering our services potentially to that company's customers. And so it's a way to enhance your reach and your offering and to benefit both sides, in my view.
And how about paid partnerships? Because when I was starting, and basically I tried to look for a lot of partnerships for mostly for startup, right? Not so much for MarsBased, because MarsBased we live off our clients and that's it, right? We really don't need partnerships. But for startup, right, you need partnerships for whatever. You get the venue for free, you get the sponsors, you get event like the catering and whatnot. And somebody told me, like, you have to look for partnerships that reflect on both sides P&L. Otherwise, this is not going to work. Like, free partnerships don't work. I don't believe that's a general rule, but maybe like that's some sort of like validation and commitment
Yeah.
and qualification of the potential partner. So what's your take on free partnerships? Like, should they exist? Should they not? And do they really apply, or do they work
I I,
not as
I
good
think
as paid partnerships?
I think you want there to be skin in the game, so to speak.
Okay.
And so it doesn't have to be, in my view, necessarily a paid exactly like dollars, euros, but you want there to be some benefit, something given on both sides. So, uh, as an example, sometimes someone gets invited to speak at an event only because they're paying. Though
Mm.
that's a different kind of partnership, sponsorship that I
Yeah,
don't always like because it's kind of pay to play. But if it's more of a, we want to be part of this platform. Okay, well, not what are you offering in return? What are you, how are you benefiting our consumers? So I don't think it always has to be a direct payment, but I do think you want there to be something coming from both sides so that both sides are invested in it. And I think that's something we think about even when we look at, say, an affiliate agreement or partnership where we don't want to offer something just for free because maybe then there's no buy-in on the other side. They're making no effort to sell something. So
exactly.
if we want there to be, and it doesn't have to be a huge amount, but you want maybe some minimum purchase guarantee, or you want a minimum amount of exposure, or you're guaranteeing, back when I was working in sports, the number of impressions. So you want there to be some buy-in. And this was at Samsung Pay, for instance, we would have, when we would sign contracts with a new financial institution, we would try to have there be some stipulation about, okay, you're going to do this promotional partnership that will encourage your customers to use Samsung Pay with your card, whether by giving an incentive, whether by putting it on when they use the ATM, putting an ad up there. So I think finding that it doesn't always, again, it doesn't have to be like a direct payment, but you want there to be some skin in the game, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. But you, as a chief partnerships officer right now at ClimateTrade, you will understand this is that if you think long term enough, like you know that people in charge of the partnership are going to change, the teams are going to change, the market's going to change. So how do you ensure that you keep aligned over time? Because most people perceive partnerships as like a set and forget, right? We negotiate, it's a
Yeah.
hard process, and once we get the deal, we tend to forget about it and we think this is going to last for 10 years. And the reality is like, no, next term or next year comes another manager, the priorities of the company change. They change from B2B to B2C, they change the product and whatever. They're like, we're not interested in this partnership anymore. Or they stop selling because they have to focus their marketing efforts somewhere else. And your partnership then suffers from it, right? How do you keep the consistency and the life of the partnership alive or align with
Yeah.
your incentives as well?
That made me think of one of my professors at Wharton. His name is Andrew Brandt, and he actually used to be an NFL agent and worked for the Green Bay Packers. And I took a negotiations class with him, and something that he talked about was, don't think of it as if you're never going to see this person again or interact with this person again. So when you're negotiating something, don't
Good.
just think about the short term. You were talking about the being short term, short sighted. Uh, Imagine, even if you're buying a car, you may interact with this person again. Think about the long term interactions. And so when you're negotiating with someone, I always want to think about the win-win for both sides, not just what am I getting out of it? What is ClimateTrade or wherever I'm working getting out of it? But how is this benefiting the other person? If you can figure out what's most important to them, you're going to do much better, because it's possible, even if someone's trying to negotiate on one specific detail, it's possible what's most important to them, something that's really easy to for you to give. And that could be, I mean, think about when you're hiring someone, maybe they really want to work remotely and that's, you don't care, or they want flexibility on their schedules. So find out what the other is really important to the other side. Now, as you said, people can change, deals can change, the goals of the company can change. So I think build in flexibility as much as you're able to. And also if you're able to lock in some sort of something that makes it harder for them to switch, stickiness. I think when you get like we do both B2B and B2B2C. So ClimateTrade, we sell carbon offsets and do other things related to sustainability. We can either sell those directly to a company or an organization, or we can integrate so their consumers are able to offset their carbon footprint. If their consumers are doing it, it's harder for them to switch because there's a whole there's no whole integration involved. They have to find a replacement. If it's B2B, it's a little easier for them to switch. Now, that's going to be different depending what your product is, your company, but to the extent that you can find something that makes it a longer term, like, oh, we need to stick around for this. I mean, I think of short-sighted, and this is one I'm pretty big on lately. So I think in sports, we see a lot of this short-sightedness, sports washing, they're calling it, I'm calling it.
Yeah.
So I think human rights and democracy are like big things.
Qatar, right? We're talking about Qatar, right?
No yeah, worries. Well, Qatar, but also Saudi Arabia.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, just generally speaking.
But there's a lot of stuff happening. You know, they're thinking someone's selling the rights or doing a partnership that's actually short-sighted and thinking, where's the long-term value? And so we want to think about that at ClimateTrade, but every company, like, who are you doing business with? Is this going to bring us money in the short term, but be a negative for us in the long term? So if you're working with people whose interests are aligned, that is more likely to bring you other like-minded customers that are looking for the same things. Again, this depends a lot on your business. How, like, we're working on sustainability, your values are really baked into that. If you're selling, I don't know, Coca-Cola, like,
okay,
maybe a different
not
story.
Coke.
Yes.
I mean, it's also a reputational thing, like
also a reputational thing, and you also are going to have different people that are interested in your product.
Very energetic people in both cases.
Yes. So, but thinking longer term about, having your values aligned, and if you understand what the values of the other company are, what's their objectives, even in what we're selling, like selling carbon offsets, different people are buying them for different reasons. They can be buying them for compliance reasons. They can be buying them because their customers are asking for it. They can be buying them because their executive leadership really cares about it. Or maybe for competitive advantage with other companies that aren't doing as much, or just for marketing PR. I mean, there's different reasons. So understanding what their reasons are can help you to change your messaging and build a different type of partnership.
Must be really difficult to kind of like cherry pick which kind of partners you want to have in your case, because I perceive that ClimateTrade can be used as a company to do some greenwashing as well, right? So while you might technically want to cherry pick some of the partners and you're like, oh, we will never work with this brand, you can see them as kind of like as a crutch to lean on to see like, well, we don't really like this brand, but if we can use or we can leverage their branding to kind of like make the pie a little bit bigger, and they give us authority, and maybe like, I don't know, seeing it as a purely in a utilitarian way of thinking, like the way we select clients at MarsBased, right? We're lucky enough that we can select our clients, but in the early days we couldn't, and sometimes we had to take some clients that in retrospect we shouldn't have taken, but because we took them, we're here, right? And so we're like, okay, in normal conditions we will not take them because of ethics. I mean, we've never done anything evil besides working for Real Madrid, but there are clients that are more karma positive than others, right? And so while we prefer working for NGOs and nonprofits, like, the reality is there's not a lot of them who can afford these kind of services. Right. However, nowadays we don't have to have these conversations because we really are like, okay, yeah, this company comes and, like, for instance, if a political party like Vox comes, it's like, no, fuck you, we're not going to work for you. We would have worked for them in the early past. But maybe some companies like I don't know, Mercadona, right? I wouldn't work for Mercadona personally nowadays, but maybe we would have worked for them in the early days because it's kind of like, well, maybe we can use them to grow our brand, give authority. It's kind of like a stepping stone, right? And so,
Right.
like in my view, this is like balancing the good and evil, but
Sure.
other people might have other perception. How is it in your case?
Well, and I think even on that, even within a company, you can have people that have different perspectives and different approaches to that. So I think, as you said, maybe your thin red line is different at different points. I would say there's probably some things that you would always say that's a red line. I'm not going to cross that. I wouldn't work with that company or that person or to enhance someone who's doing bad things in the world. Like, and again, that's all what that is, what that line is. But then maybe when you have a little bit more power, buying power, flexibility, maybe that line moves a little bit because where you would have liked it to be before, but you didn't have that flexibility. So I think there's certain things, I mean, doing things that are truly unethical or, we're very careful about the type of credits that we offer. We do a lot of due diligence on the projects. So that's something that we can do no matter what. Who you work with, also you have some lines like, this is not going to be a good decision, but others that might be, that isn't my favorite, but you probably have more flexibility at a later stage as you grow. But there's things that no matter what, at any given point, you decide that would be crossing a red line.
And how about, because kind of like this is a good segue for the next question, but it ties back to what we discussed before about the like aligning incentives and keeping the structure of the partnership alive, which is you see over time that maybe a partnership is just like it's struggling, right? It has fallen out of priority in the other on the other side's priority list, or they change teams, or they change, like, however the reputation just goes just goes down, and you don't want to be with them. So when do you decide to cut off a partner, to cancel a partnership? Because I struggle with that. I've
Yeah.
never, like,
Yeah.
literally up until this year, ninth year in operations, I've never actively canceled
Wow.
a partner.
Okay. I think we have different types of partnerships. So we have some that are deeply integrated. We have others where maybe we're a member of an organization, we're a paying member, we participate in committees, calls, meetings, etc. More corporate partnerships. I think if it depends how much time and money is involved, time and money, effort. Because if something's like, so we canceled a partnership that we actually liked, but it was very expensive to be part of it. And we decided that at this stage where we are, we're an early stage startup, we're raising a Series A. That was a cost that wasn't right for this particular moment. Something else could be low cost, but taking a lot of time in order to get max effort, max results out of it. And maybe we would decide that that's too much, because realistically, I can't clone myself, haven't figured that out yet. None of us have figured out how to clone ourselves yet. And so if something requires a lot of time, you want to see the benefits of it. I think we're trying to measure a lot better what the results are of participating in an event, going to an event, and then one thing's just going and one thing's being a sponsor or, some more active participant. I think, yeah, trying to weigh against what are you losing by participating in that? Because we get so many people reach out wanting to talk, wanting to have a call. They'll almost always, okay, usually, maybe not almost always, but usually like, oh, that sounds interesting. I would have a conversation, but you only have so many hours in the day. You can only be productive this much, figuring out what's going to be the most beneficial. And of course, you don't know 100% of the time, but trying to weigh what you have to give up if you do that partnership. And so that's something I try to take into consideration. Oh yeah, it's great to be part of, I'm not going to name any organization, but this organization, it doesn't cost a lot, but it's taking 10 hours a month of mine, and what could I do in those 10 hours instead?
I like that you have been part of both corporate and startup, so you understand both sides. You can give advice to both because being from a startup, you understand that startups move like they have an hourglass, a countdown, and therefore, yeah, you can think long term, but you don't know in 5 years' time whether the startup's going to be there or not. And you cannot really keep up with the low sales cycles of corporates. Maybe you have high barriers of entry, and therefore you're not compliant with most of the procurement processes of the big corporations and whatnot. And so, what would be your quick fire tips for startups wanted to partner with big corporations?
So I would say understand that you're going to have different timelines typically, and that can be challenging. A corporate almost always is going to be a lot slower to move, and that can
A
be
lot.
frustrating. A lot, a lot. And depending on the sector, especially if it's, say, in the financial sector, uh, financial really stands out being a lot slower, or government sector likely to be really slow. And so understanding that trade-off, that there can be big advantages to working with a corporate, but knowing that you are on different timeline, figuring out who the right people to talk with are. I've been at several big corporations, but often in sort of a startup within the organization, which isn't, it's never really a startup because you still have the resources of the big organization, but in a group that maybe didn't have as much oversight, was able to move a little more quickly. So I think that helped me make the move to startups, having that experience. But understanding how things differ, like, I remember at Samsung Pay, we'd working with banks, we'd have to get, in some cases, 5 lawyers to sign off from a bank on a piece of marketing. It was like, what? This is crazy. This is so slow. And Samsung would be like, well, we want to approve, we want this for tomorrow. Well, I'm not going to get 5 lawyers from 5 different departments at one bank to sign off on something by tomorrow. So understanding
Not
that
gonna
difference,
happen. Let's
not going to
face it.
happen. Not going to happen. We had an ad to run on the Grammys that they wanted something to be approved by tomorrow. And that one actually got through, but we had to switch to the third bank because that was a big opportunity, obviously, to have an ad on the Grammys. But understanding different timelines, understanding trying to navigate who to talk with. And the other thing is to not get excited just because someone at a company reached out to you. Like, it could be great, but if someone from Amazon, and I'm just saying Amazon as an example because it's so massive, or Walmart or Coca-Cola reaches out and says they're interested in having a discussion about a sales or a partnership opportunity, or they just want to know more. If that's like an entry level person, account manager, they don't have they don't have the decision making power. So make sure you're using your resources wisely. Maybe devoting more time to a much smaller company, but where you're talking to senior decision makers, there's real interest, is more beneficial to you than, like, if we, for instance, we entered the US market recently at ClimateTrade last year, a few months ago. And so if we're talking to, say, a smaller company in a large sector, but we see a high probability of closing that deal quickly based on interest, based on how quickly they're moving, that might be better for us to close that deal and be able to talk about publicly, be able to use that in sales and marketing, than to focus a lot of time and energy on a much bigger company that's not moving quickly, that's slow, that's not getting to the decision makers, because maybe your chances of one are 50% and the other like 5-10%.
That is really good. I really wanted to discuss like who is the person like the responsible for signing off contracts, right? And that's That's what people don't realize. Just because a company has contacted you doesn't really mean that they are going to hire you, right? Or buy your stuff. And one of the things we found at MarsBased is that, in the last few years, we started working for big corporations like Citadel Securities, HP, Ford, and whatnot. So undergone a whole lot of procurement processes. And what we found is that we're, like in Catalan, we say feta la llei, feta la trampa. So if there's a law, there's a way around it, right? There's always a way to circumvent the law. So if there's a process for procurement, there's also a fast tracking process if they're really interested. So for me, it's kind of like not a red flag, but a pseudo red flag if they don't mention this fast track. Because if they mention the fast track, it's like, bing, you got it, right? And so they really want to work with you. And so and at this point, I always bring it up. Like, we started, like right now we're about to sign with, by the time this podcast is out, we will have started working with a Boston consulting group, right? And so, and when they contacted us, I know they were talking to other people and just because everybody does. And what I always do, or what I've done in the last 2-3 years, is like, well, tell me about your procurement process. How many signatures do we need to get this through? What is the timeline expected? Because sometimes they're like, oh yeah, we want to start this project by April and it's March. It's like, well, what is your timeline like? Oh yeah, we will need this and that. It's like, it's unreasonable to think that you will have it signed by April.
Right.
So there's one way. There's always one way. Tell me about your fast tracking process. And most of the times they're like, well, yeah, we're going to go into this because we're really interested and you guys are. But if they skip this part of the conversation, for me, it's like, I know it will be very rare if we land this contract, right? Is there any way you can sort of advise startups on how to select the right person to talk to in an organization, or how to kind of like navigate all of these hierarchical jungle and entanglement and find the right person? Like, how do you know who the right person is? How do you know their incentives as well?
Great question.
Only good questions in this podcast, Kat, you know me.
If it's a big company, sometimes you can get an idea by like doing research online of what the company's focus is. Again, it depends on what you're working on. If you're working on something that's going to get press or PR, like we're working on sustainability, we may be able to find something about in their annual sustainability report about what their approach is to this. And if they've said something where we don't do carbon credits, that might be a waste of our time to try to talk to them if they've publicly stated already that that's just not the way that they're going. That won't work for all products, but to the extent that you can do any research, even just online, but if talking to other people who may have worked with them, I think that's also a great point. If you're thinking of working somewhere, talk to people who have worked there or who do work there to get a better insights into the organization. If you're connected with any people that work there, so that's one I've used a lot, whether in applying for a job, whether in connecting. I mean, now there's lots of people I'm connected with because I went to grad school with them or know them from different ways, where in the past, our work was in different sectors, but sustainability touches all sectors. So whatever you do, your company is or should be thinking in some way, big or small, about sustainability, environment. Maybe has to from a legal compliance government regulation standpoint. So if you can find people at the organization that can tell you, oh, here's who you should talk to. So that's one I use. That won't work for everybody, but if you have any, like you look at mutual LinkedIn connections, I think I'm a big connector. So I like to connect people. I connect people, I think one, I enjoy it, but it also can pay off down the line if, I didn't do that out of self-interest, but it
paying it forward, right?
Yeah, pay it forward. So those would be a couple of ways. Also, you can get a sense for certain titles. Like when I was working at MasterCard, I was working on a bill pay exchange product, And even though I'd worked on payments, I'd worked in a very different capacity of payments. And so there were different titles that we needed to look for. And if we wanted buy-in, we needed both the consumer side and like the treasury bank, which I didn't even know existed, the treasury bank, before I joined took that role on. So understanding what the titles and the departments, and then you can look for them maybe on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And that I still think LinkedIn can be really valuable for finding people. So
Exactly. And the same question, but the other way around, right? So you are in a corporate and people are like, oh, we want to talk to startups. We want to, because playing with startups is kind of like playing with toys, right? But big corporations, usually they get tired of the new toy and like, well, I mean, we've seen it in some of our clients. They acquire like a startup and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we don't need this startup anymore. Let's dismantle it. Let's sell it off, something like that. So in that sense, what would be your advice to coordinate people in your department with people with no prior experience in startups? Say, hey, you really want to go to talk to startups? Here's what you should know. Like, here's my advice as to how to approach startups, not waste their time, and whatnot. What would be like 2 or 3 quick tips for them?
Yep. Think about the size of the startup and what stage they're at. So depending, if you're a large corporate and you're looking to do something super quickly, there's a good chance, depending on what you're working on, that pre-seed startup is not for you unless you have an accelerator or something like that. So think about the stage where they're at. What's your demand in terms of how big are you, and are you looking to just pilot something for a small subset of your customers, or are you wanting them to be able to roll something out that can serve millions of people? And so thinking about that, and that also kind of gets into the size of the startup and their stage. And then what other partners have they worked with? So have they worked with any corporates or not? Now, if they're early stage, obviously at some point you have to have your first corporate that you work with, but you want to maybe think about what experience they have, if any, working with corporates, and particularly, do they have any experience working with companies in your sector? So like, we've worked with financial institutions, we've worked with banks, or with Banco Santander, for instance. So if a bank wanted to talk to us, oh, okay, yeah, they're already working with Santander. That's a super respected company, organization. It's a big organization. I feel like I can trust with that. If they haven't worked with any big corporates or aren't able to say, doesn't mean you shouldn't work with them, but it's just something to be aware of.
Okay. Last question, and you know what kind of question this is because you listen to the podcast, but that's a signature question. What's your biggest fuck up, and can you quantify it in money?
Ooh, biggest fuck up. I should have prepared for this because I listened to the podcast and I didn't.
You don't pray? Yeah, like nobody prepares. Like we prefer the spontaneous occurrences.
Biggest fuck up. I think, I mean, honestly, that when I moved to Spain before 4 years ago, it didn't work out. That was a big fuck up.
That's not really your fault, was it? Unless you took a big risk and was like, yeah, I know this might not go through, and still I want to do it.
No, I mean, it was a big fuck up that ended up paying off down the road, but like I risked a lot and lost a lot. Okay, if that doesn't count, then
yeah, more like perhaps in the field of partnerships. Like, no need to mention the partner, just, but like maybe something that you're like, oh, this partnership is just gonna go, through the roof, and then it's like, oh, we just squandered tens of thousands of dollars, something like that.
Yeah.
Don't give me the usual bullshit. Like, I know you're not gonna do it, but like, we hired the wrong person. No, that just doesn't work. Like,
yeah,
everybody says that.
We had one at Samsung Pay where there were some technical issues, and we really messed up on fulfillment of an incentive with a bank, and it was a big fuck up, and it was not fun.
Hey, was it really expensive? Like, was it tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands?
I think it made that bank less likely to work with us going forward. So yeah.
Okay, just for like a potential loss. Okay, okay, okay. Well, thank you very much. Like, I think we have a few, or like a lot of takeaways from like partnerships. I think this would be very interesting for me. Like 10 years ago when I started doing partnerships, like I wish I had known this, but obviously everybody knows a lot in retrospect. 1 minute for you, like I'm rolling the carpet here. What's how can we help you?
So ClimateTrade helps companies to offset their carbon footprint. We sell carbon offsets, and we can help either a company to reduce its carbon footprint, or we can integrate via API. So consumers can offset their carbon footprint. We're doing that in travel, financial services, any sector, entertainment. So if you're caring about the planet, reach out. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, Kat O'Brien. You can find me easily. Happy to chat how we can help you on sustainability. Also, I'm an American New Iowan / New Yorker in Spain. Super love Spain, so I'm always happy to take people's recommendations around Spain or give travel tips to people who are coming.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
for
And
having
also,
me.
I want to take the last 5 seconds to thank you for sending always interesting people and suggestions for the podcast because that keeps the podcast alive. So my thanks to you.
Thanks for having me, Alex. I appreciate it.